My name is Caleb. I'm an RF radio frequency technician for a private telecommunications firm in western Montana. My job is simple, or at least it's supposed to be. I drive out to the automated relay stations dotting the Bitterroot Range, perform diagnostic checks on the transmitters, and make sure the winter snow hasn't knocked any dishes out of alignment. Most days, it's just me, my thermos of coffee, and the endless, rolling sea of ponderosa pines. It's the kind of job where you can go 8 hours without hearing another human voice, and for a guy like me, that was the appeal. I like the predictable hum of the equipment. I like the way the spectrum analyzer shows me a world made of invisible waves. It's clean, it's logical. Last Thursday, I was sent to Station 404, a high-altitude site perched on a jagged thumb of rock we call the Needle. 404 is a dead site, meaning it's fully automated and rarely needs a physical visit. But dispatch had been getting ghost ping status reports that showed the station was drawing triple the normal power, even though all the transmitters were supposed to be in low-power standby. I reached the summit at 4 p.m. The wind was whipping through the steel lattice of the tower, making a sound like a low, mournful flute. I let myself into the concrete equipment shed, the heavy steel door groaning on its hinges. The air inside was warm, vibrating with the familiar high-pitched whine of the cooling fans. I hooked up my laptop to the main console and ran a diagnostic. Everything looked green. Power draw was normal, signal-to-noise ratio was perfect. Probably just a glitch in the telemetry, I muttered, taking a sip of coffee. But then I noticed the spectrum analyzer. There was a peak at 142.04 megahertzes, a frequency reserved for radio astronomy, usually silent. It wasn't just a stray signal, it was a perfect repeating sine wave. I patched the audio through my headset to see if it was just interference. It wasn't at first. It was just static, a wet, heavy sound like rain hitting a tin roof. But beneath the static, there was a voice. It was a man's voice, sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a very deep well. He was reciting numbers, but he wasn't speaking English. 4, 19, 0, 11. The voice stopped. Then, after a 3-second beat of silence, it spoke again. This time, it used my name. Caleb. It's cold in the wires. Why haven't you adjusted in the weight? I am in our. I froze, the headset suddenly feeling like it was made of ice. My name isn't on the station logs. My visit wasn't scheduled until 2 hours before I left the office. There was no way anyone or anything could have known I'd be standing in that shed at that exact moment. I looked at the power meter. It began to climb 100 watts, 500 watts, 2,000 watts. The cooling fans began to scream, their pitch rising until it sounded like a choir of panicked women. Outside, the flute-like sound of the wind through the tower changed. It wasn't whistling anymore. It was humming a 3-note melody I'd heard once before, in a nightmare I'd forgotten until now. The smell of ozone and hot copper filled the shed, becoming so thick I could almost taste it. I scrambled to the main power breaker, my hands trembling as I reached for the heavy lever. The metal felt vibratingly hot, even through my work gloves. I yanked it down, expecting the whine of the fans and the glow of the monitors to die instantly. They didn't. The monitors stayed bright, their screens now filled with a jagged, pulsing waveform that looked like a heartbeat made of lightning. The fans continued to scream, but the air they were blowing was no longer warm. It was freezing, a dry Arctic chill that made the condensation from my breath freeze on the console. The breaker is a suggestion, Caleb, the voice through the headset whispered. It was no longer coming from the radio receiver. The headset wasn't even plugged in anymore. The sound was vibrating directly into my jawbone through the air. The signal is the foundation. I looked at the floor. The reinforced concrete of the equipment shed was vibrating not from the wind or the tower, but from something directly beneath me. I knelt down and pressed my palm to the floor. The concrete felt hollow. More than hollow, it felt alive. I reached into my tool bag and pulled out my seismic sensor, a device I usually use to check for stability in the mountain's rock face. I switched it on and placed the probe against the floor. The reading didn't show tectonic movement. It showed a pattern. A rhythmic, subterranean pulse that was perfectly synced with the 142.04 megahertz signal on the monitors. Something was broadcasting from deep inside the mountain, using the granite of the needle as a massive natural antenna. Thump, thump, thump. The sound started to rise through the floor. It wasn't a mechanical sound. It sounded like a massive leaden hammer striking a cavern wall 1,000 feet below. With every strike, the power meter on the console spiked. 5,000 watts. 10,000 watts. The wires in the ceiling began to glow a dim, angry orange. "Who is this?" I screamed into the empty shed. "What do you want?" The monitors flickered, and for a split second, the waveform resolved into an image. It was a grainy, low-resolution video feed. I saw a man sitting in a chair, his back to the camera. He was wearing the same high-visibility jacket I was wearing. He was sitting at the same console I was standing in front of. The man in the video turned his head. He didn't have a face. Where his features should have been, there was only a swirling vortex of gray static like a TV tuned to a dead channel. Adjust. The wait. Caleb. The faceless version of me said. I looked at the heavy lead weights used for balancing the tower's guy wires stacked in the corner of the shed. One of them, a 50-pound block, was beginning to float. It didn't lift off the ground. It was being pulled toward the ceiling by an invisible, magnetic force so strong that the air around it started to hum. Suddenly, the steel door of the shed, the one I had bolted shut, began to buckle inward. Something was on the other side, and it wasn't the wind. It was a pressure, a massive silent weight that was trying to squeeze the air out of the room. The flute-like whistling of the tower outside reached a deafening pitch. And then the voice returned. But it wasn't just in my head anymore. It was coming from the tower itself, the vibrating steel acting like a giant speaker. 4, 19, 0, 11. The mountain screamed. The transmission must be pure. The air in the shed had become so ionized that my hair stood on end and every breath tasted like a mouthful of pennies. I watched, paralyzed. As the lead weights didn't just float, they began to circle the room in a slow, gravitational orbit, like dead planets around a failing star. The concrete floor beneath me felt less like stone and more like the deck of a ship in a storm, pitching and rolling as the subterranean pulse intensified. Thump, Thump, thump. Each strike from below was followed by a spray of sparks from the console. The screens were no longer showing video. They were bleeding a thick black liquid that looked like ink but smelled like burnt hair. It dripped onto the floor, and where it touched the concrete, it hissed, eating small, jagged holes into the foundation. "I'm leaving, you hear me? I'm done!" I screamed at the faceless monitors. I lunged for the door, but the pressure from the outside was too great. The steel was dented inward in the shape of a massive, elongated hand, as if something gargantuan were leaning its weight against the shed. I grabbed a heavy pipe wrench from my tool belt and began to smash at the high barred window. Crack. The glass shattered, but instead of the cold mountain air rushing in, a wave of static-filled silence poured into the room. I looked out and saw the world had turned gray. The trees, the rocks, the sky, everything was vibrating so fast they had lost their color, reduced to the same grainy visual noise I'd seen on the monitor. The tower outside the Needle was glowing with a brilliant violet St. Elmo's fire. The steel was humming a low, guttural chant that I finally recognized. It wasn't a melody. It was a countdown. 4, 19, 0, 11. I realized then that the numbers weren't a code. They were coordinates. Not for a location on a map, but for a depth. 4,000, 1,900 feet, 0 inches, 11 minutes until the uplink was complete. Something was trying to tunnel upward using sound, and station 404 was the exit point. I looked at the main transmitter bank. If I couldn't cut the power, I had to overload the signal. I had to create a feedback loop so violent it would shatter the crystal oscillators inside the mountain. I grabbed the diagnostic cable and jammed it back into the console, bypassing the safety limiters. My laptop screen flickered, showing a warning. "Critical harmonic imbalance. That's the point," I whispered. I began to sweep the transmission frequency across the entire band, forcing the station to broadcast a chaotic white noise scream. The sound inside the shed became unbearable. It wasn't just loud. It was a physical force that started to tear the skin on my knuckles and nose. The faceless man on the monitor screamed a sound of pure digital agony. The gray world outside the window began to fracture. "Caleb, the wait is too much." The voices hissed, thousands of them now, sounding like a crowd drowning in a sea of static. The floor beneath my feet finally gave way. Not a collapse, but a rupture. A jagged crack opened in the concrete, and a beam of cold violet light shot upward, piercing through the roof of the shed like a spear. I was thrown backward, my head hitting the metal cabinet. As the world started to go black, I saw the shadow from the door finally break through. It wasn't a monster. It was a silhouette made of pure, vibrating radio waves, a man-shaped hole in the universe. It walked toward me, its hand reaching out, its fingers trailing long, thin lines of static behind them. "Adjust the weight," it whispered, and its voice was the last thing I heard before the mountain erupted in a final, deafening burst of silence. I woke up at the base of the Needle, lying in a bed of frozen pine needles and shattered glass. The sun was pale, a weak winter light that didn't seem to offer any warmth. My head felt like it had been hollowed out and filled with lead, and there was a constant, high-pitched ringing in my ears that made the world feel distant, like I was watching my own life through a thick pane of plexiglass. I looked up at the summit. Station 404 was gone. Not destroyed, not burned, just gone. The jagged thumb of rock where the concrete shed and the steel tower had stood was now smooth, sheared off as if by a giant invisible blade. There was no debris, no scorched earth, only a perfectly flat circle of granite that glimmered with a faint violet iridescence. Dispatch found me 3 hours later. They said the station had suffered a catastrophic structural failure due to an unprecedented seismic event. They told me I was lucky to be alive, that the blast must have thrown me clear before the summit collapsed. But they couldn't explain the state of my equipment. My laptop was found half a mile away, its casing melted into a shape that resembled a human rib cage. And my headset, the plastic, was fused together, forming a solid black ring. When the technicians tried to analyze the last data packets sent from my console, they didn't find code. They found a recording of a human heartbeat that lasted for exactly 4 hours, 19 minutes, and 11 seconds. I was put on medical leave. Acoustic shock, the company doctors called it. They gave me pills for the vertigo and told me the ringing in my ears would fade with time. They were wrong. The ringing didn't fade, it evolved. It's no longer a sharp whine. It's a low, rhythmic hum that I feel in my teeth every time I get near an electronic device. When I walk past a radio, the speakers crackle with a voice that sounds like my own, reciting numbers in a language I shouldn't understand. I moved to a cabin in the valley, far away from the relay stations and the towers. I don't use a cell phone. I don't have a TV. I live by the light of kerosene lamps and the warmth of a wood stove. I thought that by removing the receivers, I could stop the transmission. But 3 nights ago, the routine broke again. I was sitting by the fire, the silence of the Montana woods heavy around me, when I felt a vibration in the floorboards. Thump, thump, thump. It was coming from deep inside the earth, perfectly synced with the pulse in my own chest. I looked at my hands in the firelight. For a split second, they didn't look like flesh and bone. They looked like gray, grainy static, flickering in and out of existence. I reached for my coffee mug, but my hand passed right through the ceramic. I watched, paralyzed, as the mug began to float, rising slowly toward the ceiling as if caught in an invisible, magnetic tide. The air in the cabin grew freezing, and the smell of ozone filled the room. Then, from the old, disconnected, battery-powered radio on the shelf, a voice drifted out. It was a man's voice, sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a very deep well. Caleb, the uplink is shifting. We need more weight. I looked toward the corner of the room. A silhouette was standing there, a man-shaped hole in the dark, vibrating with a violet St. Elmo's fire. It didn't have a face, but it held out a hand, its fingers trailing long, thin lines of static that reached for my heart. I didn't run. I couldn't. I realized then that I wasn't the technician anymore. I was the antenna. Station 404 hadn't vanished. It had just changed its frequency, and I was the only one tuned into the broadcast. I'm writing this now because the vibration in the floor is getting louder. The walls of my cabin are beginning to hum, the wood shrieking as the mountain begins to pull. If you find this, stay away from the high places. Stay away from the silence. Because once the mountain has your frequency, it doesn't matter how far you run. The transmission is never over. It's just waiting for the next receiver to adjust the weight. My name is Elias. I live in a small, weathered bungalow on the outskirts of a dying mining town in Nevada. Out here, the wind is the only neighbor you can count on, and the desert has a way of swallowing sounds before they can reach the next house. I'm a man of simple routines. I check my perimeter, I lock my doors at 9 p.m., and I never answer the door after the sun has dipped below the jagged line of the Sierras. It's a lonely life, but in the desert, loneliness is a form of protection. 2 weeks ago, on a Tuesday that felt as heavy and dry as a kiln, the routine broke. I was sitting in my armchair, the only light coming from a small reading lamp, when a sound vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the settling of the house. It was a knock. 3 slow, rhythmic raps on my front door. Thud, thud, thud. My heart did a slow, painful roll in my chest. No one comes out here. Not the mailman, not the sheriff, and certainly not a friend. I stayed perfectly still, my eyes fixed on the shadow beneath the door. Elias? We're lost. Can we come in and use your phone? The voice was thin, high-pitched, and unnaturally flat. It was the voice of a child, maybe 10 or 11 years old, but it lacked the inflection of youth. It sounded like a recording of a child played back through a filter of static. I didn't answer. I reached for the heavy flashlight on the side table, but I didn't turn it on. Elias, please. It's so cold out here. Our parents are coming. We just need to call them. Just open the door a little bit. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. I could see my breath blooming in the air, a white ghost in the lamplight. My house has thick walls, but I could hear their breathing, not the quick, shallow breaths of a scared child, but a slow, synchronized rasp that sounded like dry leaves skittering across pavement. I walked to the window beside the door, pulling back the heavy curtain just an inch. There were 2 of them, a boy and a girl, standing side by side on my porch. They were dressed in clothes that looked like they belonged in a Sears catalog from 1,955 stiff wool coats and polished shoes that showed no dust from the desert road. They were pale, almost translucent in the moonlight, and their heads were bowed, hiding their faces in the shadows. I don't have a phone, I said, my voice sounding like gravel. Go back to the main road. There's a station 5 miles up. The boy lifted his head. In the pale silver light of the moon, I saw them. He didn't have irises, he didn't have pupils, his eyes were solid, light-absorbing pits of ink. They weren't just black, they were a void. Looking into them felt like looking off the edge of a cliff in the middle of a starless night. We can't go to the road, Elias, the boy said. His lips didn't move in sync with the words. We need to be invited, just let us in. It won't take long. We just want to see the light. The girl lifted her head then, and her eyes were the same twin abysses that seemed to pull the light out of the room. She smiled, and her teeth were too white, too many, and far too sharp. I pulled the curtain shut, my hands trembling so violently that the fabric hissed against the glass. I backed away from the window, but the image of those eyes, those hungry, infinite voids, remained burned into my retinas. They didn't just look at me. They felt like they were pouring something cold and heavy into my mind. Elias, we can see you behind the cloth. The boy's voice drifted through the wood. It was louder now, as if the door were made of paper instead of solid oak. The curtain is just a thin skin. It doesn't hide your heart. I retreated into the kitchen, fumbling for the light switch. I flipped it. Nothing. The bulb didn't just fail. I heard the filament snap with a tiny crystalline ping. I tried the lamp in the hallway. Same result. One by one, the lights in my house were dying, extinguished by a presence that seemed to feed on electricity. The knocking started again, but it wasn't on the front door anymore. Thud, thud, thud. It came from the kitchen window. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. There was no one outside the glass, just the vast, indifferent desert. But the sound continued. Thud, thud, thud. Now it was coming from the floorboards beneath my feet, then from the ceiling. They were surrounding the house, but not in a physical way. They were surrounding my perception. Elias? The air is getting thin in there, isn't it? The girl's voice was right behind me. I whirled around, swinging the heavy mag light. The hallway was empty, but the smell was unmistakable. It was the scent of wet soot and old stagnant ozone, the smell of a fire that had been put out a long time ago. I didn't invite you, I screamed, my voice cracking. You have no right. Get off my property. Property is a human lie, Elias, the boy replied. I could hear him pacing on the porch, his footsteps sounding like dry bones clicking together. We don't want your house. We want the warmth. You've been hoarding it for so long. All that life, just sitting in the dark. I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my nose. I reached up and felt something wet. Blood. It was a slow, thick trickle, identical to the acoustic trauma I'd experienced in the woods. But this was different. This was the result of a psychic pressure, a weight on my brain that was trying to force me to do the one thing I knew would be my end. I looked at the front door. My hand began to move toward the deadbolt. It wasn't my will, it was my muscles acting on their own, responding to a frequency I couldn't hear. Just a little crack, Elias, the children said in unison, their voices perfectly synced, just enough for the shadow to breathe. I fought it. I grabbed my right wrist with my left hand, gasping as I struggled against my own body. I forced myself toward the kitchen, toward the heavy iron stove. I needed a distraction. I needed a different kind of routine. I grabbed a cast iron skillet and slammed it against the countertop. Clang. The sound was a jagged edge in the unnatural silence. The pressure in my head flickered for a second. I did it again. Clang. Clang. You don't like noise, do you? I gritted my teeth, the blood now dripping onto my shirt. You like the quiet. You like the whisper. Well, not tonight. The knocking on the walls grew frantic, a chaotic drumming that sounded like 1,000 hailstones hitting the house. The house began to groan, the timber shrieking under a weight that shouldn't be there. And then the front door, the heavy, locked, bolted door, began to glow. Not with light, but with a dark, pulsating aura that made the wood look like it was rotting in real time. The door is tired, Elias, the girl whispered, and I could feel her breath on the back of my neck, even though the hallway was empty. It wants to be a mouth. The iron skillet felt like it weighed 100 pounds, but it was the only thing keeping the static in my brain from turning into a total blackout. Every time I slammed it against the counter, the dark aura around the front door flinched, retreating for a split second before pulsing back with even more intensity. But the house was failing me. I looked at the hallway walls. The floral wallpaper, which had been there since I bought the place in '88, was curling and blackening. It wasn't burning, it was wilting. Underneath the paper, the lath and plaster were turning into something that looked like gray, porous bone. My home was becoming a skeleton. Elias, the house is just a body. The boy's voice came from the vents now. It was wet, gurgling, as if the air ducts were filled with mud. And like any body, it has holes. Why do you struggle to keep the skin intact? I backed into the living room, my flashlight beam flickering. The shadows in the corners weren't staying in the corners anymore. They were stretching out, reaching for my boots like long, ink-stained fingers. I shined the light at the ceiling and my breath hitched. The two children were there. They weren't standing on the floor. They were standing on the ceiling, their polished shoes stuck to the plaster as if gravity were a suggestion they chose to ignore. Their heads were hanging down, their necks elongated and twisting at impossible angles to look at me. Those eyes. Up close, they weren't just black. I could see depth in them, miles and miles of empty, starless space. I felt a pull, a literal physical suction, trying to draw my consciousness into those ink pits. We're already inside, Elias, the girl whispered. Her hair hung down like a curtain of dead silk, brushing against the top of my head. It felt like cold needles. The invitation was in your fear. Every time your heart skipped a beat, you opened a window. I swung the mag light at her, but the heavy metal passed right through her torso as if she were made of smoke. She didn't flinch. She just giggled a sound that was a perfect, chilling mimicry of a wind chime in a graveyard. You're not real, I choked out, the blood from my nose now staining the floorboards. You're a projection, a trick of the air. If we aren't real, why is your house dying? The boy asked. He began to walk across the ceiling toward the kitchen, his steps making the wood groan as if a heavy safe were being dragged across it. Why is your blood so cold, Elias? Why is your routine so empty? He reached the center of the room and dropped. He didn't fall. He descended, his body unfolding in midair until he landed silently on the carpet in front of me. The girl followed, landing right behind him. They stood there, two small figures in 1950s wool coats, blocking my path to the back door. The air around them was vibrating so fast it was creating a hum that made my teeth ache. The boy reached out a pale, thin hand. His fingers were too long, and they didn't have knuckles, just smooth, tapering flesh that ended in sharp black points. The light is almost gone, Elias, he said. He pointed to the last lamp in the corner, the only one still struggling to stay lit. The bulb was flickering in a rhythmic pattern, short, long, short, SOS. Once that goes out, the house is ours. But if you open the door now, if you let the rest of us in, we might leave a little bit of you behind, a memory of a routine, a ghost in the vents. I looked at the lamp. I looked at the boy. I realized that they weren't waiting for me to open the door because they couldn't get in. They were waiting for me to surrender the space. They needed me to acknowledge that the house was no longer mine. I tightened my grip on the skillet. I've lived in this desert for 40 years, I whispered. I've survived flash floods, scorpions, and the kind of silence that drives men mad. You think I'm afraid of a couple of shadows in Sunday suits? The girl's face distorted, her jaw unhinged, her mouth opening wider and wider until it was a gaping black maw that took up half her face. Then we will eat the silence. First, she shrieked. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light, it was a weight. It felt like being buried alive in a tomb of cold velvet. My heart was the only thing making noise now, a frantic, uneven drumming against my ribs that seemed to be the only thing keeping me from dissolving into the shadows. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I knew they were there, standing in the void, their black eyes invisible, but their hunger palpable. It's so quiet now, Elias, the boy's voice whispered, seemingly from inside my own skull. No more clanging, no more routine, just the long, beautiful cold. I felt a hand touch my cheek. It wasn't cold like ice, it was cold like the absence of heat. A vacuum that started to pull the warmth directly out of my skin. I felt my memories starting to flicker the face of my mother. The smell of the desert rain, the sound of my father's old truck, they were being deleted, one by one, replaced by a flat, gray static. I reached into my pocket. My fingers found the small brass Zippo lighter I'd carried since my days in the mines. It was a heavy, mechanical thing. Real. Solid. I didn't try to run. I didn't try to fight. I just struck the flint. Scritch. Scritch. A spark. Just a tiny orange spark in the middle of the infinite black. The children hissed, a sound like steam escaping a pressurized pipe. They recoiled, the small circle of orange light acting like a physical barrier. The light is mine, I rasped, my voice sounding like breaking glass. The house is mine, and the silence belongs to the desert, not to you. I struck it again. This time, the wick caught. A small, dancing flame bloomed in the center of the living room. In its flickering light, I saw them. They weren't children anymore. They were tall, thin columns of smoke like ash, their black eyes the only solid things about them. They were fading, their forms losing cohesion in the presence of a light they hadn't invited. You can't hold it forever. The girl's voice trailed off, sounding like a dying radio signal. The fuel will run out. Then I'll burn the house down with me in it, I said, my voice steady for the first time that night. But you aren't getting the invitation. The shadows lunged, one last desperate surge of darkness. I held the lighter high, the flame burning my thumb, but I didn't let go. I didn't blink. I stared straight into the void until the void blinked first. With a sound like a heavy curtain being torn, the pressure snapped. The cold evaporated. The smell of soot and ozone vanished, replaced by the dry, dusty scent of Nevada sagebrush. I stood alone in my living room. The front door was closed, the bolt still thrown. The walls were just wood and plaster again, no longer looking like rotting bone. I sat in my armchair and watched that tiny flame until the fuel finally ran out. I sat in the dark for the rest of the night, listening to the wind. The sun rose over the Sierras, bleeding a deep, honest orange across the desert floor. I got up, made a cup of coffee, and performed my routine. I checked the perimeter, I checked the locks, but when I looked in the hallway mirror, I stopped. My hair, which had been salt and pepper the night before, was now a shocking snow white, and in the corner of my left eye, there was a tiny pinprick spot of absolute light-absorbing black. I went to my front porch to check the mail. There was nothing in the box, but as I turned to go back inside, I saw it. On the welcome mat sat a small, red plastic fire truck. It was identical to the one from the woods, but this one was covered in a fine, black dust that felt like soot. I picked it up. It was cold. I looked out toward the main road. Far in the distance, near the shimmering heat of the horizon, I saw two small figures in wool coats, standing side by side. They weren't moving. They were just watching. I didn't lock the door that night. I didn't need to. I realized then that they weren't trying to get in anymore. They were just waiting for me to finish the transformation. Because once you've looked into the void doesn't need an invitation. It just waits for you to forget how to keep the light burning. The last lamp exploded. Total darkness swallowed the room. "Please, Elias," she whispered. "The dark is so heavy. Let us share yours."